So I'm delighted to be with you all here today. My name is Sarah Ahmed, and I'm a post-institutional feminist of colour. I often say that post-institutional is probably a little bit optimistic, but maybe it's also a little bit pessimistic, because in the last few years I've been lucky to collaborate with scholars and with students working here at Cambridge University to create spaces for Black feminism and feminism of colour, so we can still work on institutions even if we don't work at them. And today we are on it. And working on institutions is also about making use of institutional resources for our own purposes. And today, I think, we have been making the very best use of this institution's resources. So I want to thank everybody, from myself, but also from you, that has been part of that work, that project of repurposing resources for Black feminism today, especially everyone in the Decolonising Sociology or even Decolonising Society group. Black feminism is where Black feminism needs to be. Black feminism needs to be everywhere. In the university, yes, the factory, the home, the prison, and the school. So I'm very pleased to be introducing Professor Gina Dent today. Gina Dent is a scholar who has enacted her commitments to Black feminism as an abolitionist project, as a project of ending incarceration, taking Black feminism where it needs to be, where it needs to go, into prisons themselves. I want to mention the conversation between Gina and Angela Davis entitled Prison as Borders, which I recommend you read. It was published in Science in 2001. And I understand the title of that conversation is a title of one of Gina's forthcoming books, Prison as Borders. And just so that you can experience the joy of anticipation, she has another forthcoming book entitled Anchored to the Real, Black Literature in the Wake of Anthropology. I'll try and acquire patience, which has never been one of my own personal virtues. In their conversation, Gina notes that the prison industrial complex underwrites the social problems that it purports to resolve. The resolution of a problem can be the problem, which is to say, social problems are often disguised by being presented as if they were solutions. And in this important conversation, Gina teaches us that to be up to the task of describing the problem in such a way that we do not underwrite it, that we do not reproduce it, requires new kinds of feminist knowledge that, to quote from her, knowledges that start from the position of those women on the underside of capital, but does not put them in a cage. Such knowledges do not start from here, the university, say, and go there, the prison, but starts from there, which means we need to go there, to start there, to have conversations that are not just here, but there, not just then, but now. In other words, conversations across different times and spaces. Sometimes we have work to do to build institutions so that we can do our work. And Gina has done in the past decade or more a lot of institution building. She's played a crucial role in shaping the Feminist Studies project and program at UC Santa Cruz. And she's also shown in her many talks and travels a commitment to an expansive and transnational Black feminism, concerned with the task of dismantling all institutions that reproduce violence, and of learning not only about, but from the connections between those institutions. Gina has also written about the kinds of values that we might need to build alternative worlds, and I would say that we're part of that building project here today. To quote from the introduction to Black popular culture, which was first published in 1992, these are your words: pleasure under commodified conditions tends to be inwards. You take it with you, and it's a highly individualized unit. But joy tries to cut across that. Joy tries to get to the non-market values: love, kindness, care, solidarity, the struggle for justice, values that provide the possibility of bringing people together. So even as a killjoy, I get it. I totally get how joy can get us to places other than the market, providing the possibility of bringing people together. I get that because we're doing that. So please join me in welcoming Gina to speak.
Well, first of all, I have to say it's a great honor to be introduced by someone like Sara Ahmed, who, well, actually, there's no one like Sara Ahmed. So I'll just say it's a great pleasure to be introduced by Sara Ahmed, who can put thinking into everything, including an introduction. And it was amazing to hear my own words, which, of course, many of us know we don't recognize them later, to hear them again and try to think about them. It made me realize actually how much at that age, when I worked on Black popular culture, when I was a graduate student at Columbia University, I was not merely, that's self-undermining, but I was echoing, I was underscoring the words and the themes of Black feminism that I had so internalized by that time, relying on so many of the people that have already been quoted today, and many others actually who have not yet been named or quoted that I'd like also to think about. But before I do that, I just want to thank you for indulging me at the end of a day. And I told some of the, I'm just going to call you younger people, sorry, here that when I was asked to do a keynote, I had a very formal idea in mind. I mean, after all, it's Cambridge, and it's going to be a keynote at the end of a academic conference. So I thought, oh, well, I better really study up and present my research in a certain way. But after being here and getting to know people and even seeing the organizing that preceded, I realized that as the end of our day, I want mostly to make it possible for us to reflect on what we have heard and for us to experience a conversation together. So I'm going to try by giving you a few stories and introducing some questions to reflect also on what we've done, and also to issue a few challenges, which are not merely challenges to you, but they're challenges to myself and to the organizers that I work with, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world, in particular Australia, Brazil, Colombia, where I stay connected to many issues. And in those environments, of course, I won't be able to invoke all of the details of those struggles, but I want to suggest that that work is more than solidarity work. It's more than understanding my responsibility to cite someone else's struggle. Rather, what I'm trying to lay out is my sense of connectedness to all of these different movements, my sense of being in those movements, whether or not I'm there, and often my sense of being able to do things for those movements because of passport privilege that some of those in those movements cannot do. This is, of course, also another footnote to Black feminism, and many of the people who taught me to be this way are already cited for all of us. I want to thank the Decolonizing Sociology Project. I have many people that I'd like to thank who are working here, but I really have to give a special acknowledgement to Sarah Franklin, who has made every moment of our time here special and has made sure we feel taken care of. And of course, all of the students and staff who have helped, including, I'm just naming the ones that I happen to know about, Lois and Joe and Priscilla and Lola, and I may be getting it wrong, Asia. There's some others. I'm trying to remember everyone that has taken me around, given me a meal. Monica, of course, Monica and who hosted us and made us feel tremendously welcome. And in these environments, I always feel when I come to stand at the podium that I wish that I could reflect all that I've gained from those encounters, because those are really the places where I feel that I learn most deeply. However, I don't want that to seem like an anti-intellectual proposition. In other words, I've been really inspired by the way that in this room we have not conceded to an environment which treats academic work and other kinds of intellectual work and activist work as being separable. And I was so amazed, and I tried not to be too proud, seeing the panels earlier today and the facility with which all of those people who participated were able to move back and forth between situating their own stories and talking about the relationships to each other and talking about the errors that they have come to think about differently and speaking through their differences and also speaking to the texts, sometimes knowingly and sometimes in ways that make us feel that there is not, never a time we should think of this as a futile project, because it's clear that the work that we all do is moving around the world in fantastic ways. So I said it earlier to some of you, and I won't say exactly what I said after I heard the panels earlier, but I pretty much said I needed a new talk. Some of you know exactly what I said. But I want to point to some of the emphases that I heard that I would have wanted to point you toward in describing abolition feminism. For one thing, the denial of coevalence to Black feminist theory. That is, the denial not only of the sense of developing alongside other theories and not being recognized, but also developing and moving not toward the same goals. And I think that sense of Black feminist theory as being both expansive and internally fragmented, but at the same time as moving in directions that are going to consistently be challenging to the larger critical theory environment is something that was emphasized so many times today. There was also the reconceptualization of what violence is. That those that are labeled the violent are the ones that we're now trying to return to the fold and to think differently about, and that what we actually are characterizing as violent are those hierarchical systems, those state systems, those capitalist projects that are the ones that actually endanger all of us. They were descriptions of a carceral feminism, which fortunately we have not had emerge today in the voices of anyone who's spoken. Everything here has been infused with a deep sense of what it means to work against carceral feminism, even as the difficulties of doing that have been acknowledged all along the way. We had some conversation also about things that are harder for us in movement sometimes, especially when we have very few resources. For example, fully considering differently abled bodies and fully thinking about the spectrum of issues that the prison industrial complex also exacerbates, that we sometimes deprioritize. But here we've already had a conversation in part about disability, and I've been pleased to have a longer one with some members of this audience over the last few days. It's been very clear that we are in a trans-inclusive space, that the identity woman is not one that we are invested in preserving. And for me, this is an incredibly exciting and almost, it almost made me not note it, but I realized that we're still in a moment when not saying something about it would be actually to underscore that exclusion once more. So all of this, which we have already experienced, was deeply exciting to me. And made me realize that we are up to, collectively, a different kind of set of challenges. I did have to say, though, that the citational politics surprised me because I heard so many people cited who are US Black women, and I didn't hear so many of the names that I recognize, having come up academically and politically in the 80s and 90s. Several of those people are in this room. And I'm looking in the eyes of Gail Lewis, and I was listening earlier to the panel on Heart of the Race. And of course, there are some who've traveled across the pond, like Kumkum Babnani and the late Swati Mitra, who was incredibly important to me when I was coming up, Julia Sudbury, now known as Chinyere Opara, and of course historical figures like Claudia Jones, who have been so inspiring for me. And I should also include the deep influence Black British cultural studies and the work of Stuart Hall has had on my own career. And I'll just take a moment to say that I have often taken Black British cultural studies and Black British feminism as a model that helped me in the United States context to explain, especially on the East Coast, where things are quite different from the Californian environment that I was raised in, because the mixing and the crossing and the different periods of migration and the different struggles that are created were actually more analogous to the ones that I was familiar with from being from California. So I want to invoke those names here, and I want to try to also remind us of the particular legacies of those feminisms that sometimes we forget, because it's always hardest to see those who are closest to us. It's always hardest to see those who we should be citing because they're the ones we've internalized. Since I said that, I will tell you that the person who taught me most about this is someone named Juanima Lubiano, who teaches at Duke University in the United States. And she taught me something very early. She said, when you write, make sure that you cite the people that you are most influenced by, that you probably will not remember to say anything about for the rest of what you are writing. Because it's those people that you keep close, those people that are dear, but they're also the ones that you are not excited about in the same way because they've been part of producing who you are. So for me, all of the excitement of coming here is about being in an environment that taught me so very much. And I have to add to that a large part of my own career has been influenced by, and by that I mean activist and academic career, I don't really mean just my job, has been influenced by a lot of African and Caribbean feminists, and I would be remiss, and maybe she'll be mad, but anyway, if I did not mention that Bibi Bakara Youssef is in the room with us, and Bibi's work at Cassava Press has been so important, and having met her in Accra some years ago, yes, it was a special experience. So as a comparative literature PhD, and as someone who, as Sarah leaked out, has a project that thinks about anthropology and African American literature, I would be tempted actually to talk a lot about that project, but I won't. But I will want to say one thing about it. That project is a project about the transition in the United States in US Black literature from the 19th century to the 20th century. It ends with a period of consolidation of Black identity in approximately the 1940s and 50s, and here's what I mean by this. In the 19th century, Black writers who did not go under that name at the time were struggling to understand how they could be perceived as those who were connected to other people of color without that being a pathological connection. In other words, racism was the only context they had to explain their relatedness to each other. The narrative about the United States at the time is that all Africanisms and all connections to the African past and also the Caribbean and Latin American past, depending on how people moved, had been disappeared. And that there was nothing that was going to be able to build a positive sense of connection between one body and another. So at that time, in the 19th century, the major novels that we have that ground our tradition were about women who were passing, and their passing would allow them to interact with white people so that from the novel's perspective, you would come to recognize that they were just like those white people. Of course, it would emerge that they were people of color later on, and then, of course, there'd either be a tragic or happy result. But the point was that there was nothing that would distinguish them from any of the white subjects that they were around. But by the 20th century, Black writers were not satisfied with those kinds of arguments. In connection with relating to anti-colonial struggles or starting to understand colonialism and the new migrations, especially as we characterize the Harlem Renaissance in the United States, those new sets of relations between different kinds of Black subjects were making it possible to think about cultural connections that were not purely racial. And so writing about this led me to find that those connections and that multicultural Blackness then disappears. It then becomes that which grounds a definition of what African American or US Black culture looks like. The disappearance of the information and material and cultural ideas from other Black people was submerged. Those things were disappeared so that we now have a sense of what African American culture is. I say this, and some people will know why, I'm particularly concerned about this today after having read some news recently, because we are in a moment where more recent migrants to the United States are being distinguished from those who are descendants of US slavery and lived within the territorial US. I feel that this audience will recognize the danger of this, and it makes me feel that the story which I started to tell back when I was doing my dissertation research and thought maybe there was no place for, now actually has a place. So I say that to say that in order to do that research, I had to learn from Black British feminism. I had to learn from African feminism. I had to learn from the anthropological research that was done by US Black people and other kinds of Black populations, and also to deal with the politics of how they did that research and what they suppressed and what made it into our current environment in terms of a conversation about our similarities and our differences and our struggles. So for me, the references to imperialism, the analyses of colonialism, the organizing of the working class, the internationalist movements were all of those things that I needed to understand in order to explain something which, for those people who were teaching this literature, didn't belong. Because what they were teaching ostensibly was something which had always already been US Black literature. And what I wanted to try and demonstrate was the way in which we have benefited from this kind of connectivity, and that the lack of it was going to be politically dangerous for us. So I'm not going to speak more about that, but I do want you to understand that, because I think it will make it clear why the examples and stories I'm going to tell you now were selected from my work with abolition feminism. That work, for me, always comes in the wake of this larger exposure to these kinds of conversations, and I am forever indebted to that work. As an abolitionist organizing, I've been a part of work in the last few decades, when you get a little Gray, you stopped saying how many. I want to talk about some challenges from where I think we sit now. And I've been so pleased to realize, being in this room, that I think it's possible for me to lay these challenges out and have a robust conversation with all of you, because I think we're getting prepared to try and think about some of them. So the first story comes from work with a research group that Angela organized and was a part of, that occurred in 2000 at the University of California Research Institute in Humanities Research Institute in Southern California. That critical resistance research group was formed in the wake of our all participating in the Critical Resistance Conference, which some of you might know about, in 1998 at UC Berkeley. It's the conference which is known for creating the grounds for a larger movement against the prison industrial complex. In fact, one of our objectives at the time was to popularize the concept of the prison industrial complex, which Mike Davis had given us, but which had not yet come into regular use. During our time as researchers at the University of California, we determined that we were going to do prison visits as a part of our work together. And we were not going to be doing what most researchers do who are doing what were then considered prison studies. We weren't going to be studying prisoners. We were going to be studying the prison. Now, this sounds like a minor thing, but it's actually quite a radical shift, and especially as you're trying to get permission to enter prisons, you have to explain what it is that you want to study. And so we spent a lot of time reading Policing the Crisis, reading many of the other important texts, and talking about how we would conceptualize what we wanted to ask of these institutions. And so we said we wanted to see their libraries, their medical facilities. We wanted to see solitary confinement or administrative segregation, as it's called. We wanted to meet with prisoners, not interview prisoners. We wanted to see the dining halls. In other words, we were asking for a tour of the prison, which was what the term we had to use, that would cut right into the important ways in which the prison was attempting to take the space of what could be therapeutic attention, intellectual training, and other kinds of things. During one of our visits to the California Institution for Women, a woman had asked to meet with us. And we're actually not sure, we don't even know how she really knew that we were coming. But this was a very industrious young woman then who wanted to meet with us, and she wanted us to tell her story. So I've been telling it ever since. Her name is Cassandra, and she wanted to meet with us to say that she had nothing to do in the prison. And so the prison always treated her as if she was a lot of trouble. She spent a lot of time in isolation and administrative segregation. And here are the reasons why she was a lot of trouble. She had a high school degree before she entered the prison, so she was not entitled to access any higher education. She did not have a background with any drug use or alcoholism, so she wasn't going to be able to be in any of the programs they were providing for those resources. She had no children, so she wasn't going to be in any courses that were going to teach her better parenting. She wasn't on and on and on. She wasn't she didn't fit into any of the roles that the prison had ascribed to women. So she wanted us to understand not that she was so exceptional and why she should be let out just because she wasn't those things, but to tell us something about what the prison was ostensibly doing for women and why it was that her story was dangerous to the prison industrial complex. So I've carried this story since then because we spend a lot of time, and we heard this today, and it's very important for us to talk about how many women in prison have children on the outside. But a lot of times we use that to justify our interest in those women who are inside. A lot of times we hear about the fact that people who are in prison suffer childhood sexual violence, and that is absolutely true. But if we also don't pay attention to the fact that some people are in prison who haven't had that experience, we're actually suggesting that these other people are also not worth our attention. Cassandra had also been convicted of a violent crime. She had killed her boyfriend after they had an altercation, so she was considered a very dangerous prisoner. But of course, the way in which she taught us to understand how dangerous prisoners were thought of in the California prison system had to do with the way in which they were classified. She taught us a lot about classification, and the guards confirmed it. When we went on our tours, the guards would say, well, this person is a class 2 prisoner, or this person is a class 3 prisoner. And we were asking, well, what does that mean? What it meant was, however a prisoner is classified was how they were going to act. And the system itself was aware that if you lowered the classification of people who were inside, they were actually going to behave differently. But rather than taking that as an assault on their own ways of actually organizing prisoners, they saw this as a justification for their classificatory system. And Cassandra was teaching us also about this. There are many other things that we learned from her in that very short meeting on that day that I will never forget. And I've always been sorry that I don't know exactly what happened with her. But I use her as a kind of example because just as when Angela Davis was first writing about women in prison many years ago, and she made the argument that looking at women in prison wasn't a minority issue that we shouldn't pay attention to, but it was precisely a minority issue, and therefore we should pay attention. This is the concept of what we now refer to as intersectionality, where you look not at what's happening to the vast majority of people, but you look at the very instances in which they're actually challenging the way in which we've conceptualized the problem. In this case, for me, Cassandra is always a reminder. A second experience I had in working with prison abolitionists was when we wanted to do a film festival, just in the wake of the Critical Resistance Conference. We were trying to think of a number of different ways in which we would keep the movement going or help to build the movement. And we had done things like have Go to Prison Week, which didn't mean actually everyone get arrested. It actually meant like, if you've never been inside a prison, try to find a way to get inside a prison, offer to teach a course, or try to get permission to visit, or do something that would break that barrier down. Because so many people who were talking then about prisons had actually never stepped foot inside of a prison. But we landed on also having a film festival, and we had a really interesting set of conversations about that. Most of what people wanted to show at the time were documentaries, because the idea was we would show people the truth of what really happens inside the prison. But my own background, as Sarah has revealed, also included thinking about popular culture. And I wanted to make sure that we also screened things that were fictional forms or cartoons or other kinds of things that I believe actually often have a more deep, leave a more deep impression on the way in which we normalize the prison system. In other words, as I was doing at the time, I would do an internet search in what was then the online TV guide, which I think no longer needs to exist, and I would look for references to jails or prisons, and you could find one at any hour of the day, depending on how you thought of it. So if you're talking about the news, or if you're talking about cartoons, or if you're talking about some fictional film, or if you're talking about a Law and Order episode, every hour of every day, there was something involving criminal justice and the prison system. But a lot of what we were actually all consuming, we were not talking about, we were not interrogating, we were not thinking through. So for me, what I learned partly from British cultural studies and partly from my own later work was that we needed to pay attention also there. And that also would be a space to join with people on the inside, meaning inside the prison, to have conversations. So some of what we did when we went on prison visits, for example, was we were talking about, I would ask people, what they thought about the prison from what they had consumed of television and film before they got inside. And a really interesting thing would happen. At the beginning of the conversation, people would say, oh yeah, it was a lot like that, it's terrible. And then after a while, they would say, the conversation would turn, and we would start talking about what people were actually experiencing. And a lot of times it would be things like incredible boredom, or the inability to feel like they could organize their days on their own anymore because of institutionalization, or a lot of things that the film environment wasn't actually representing, and yet, even for people who had been inside, the narratives they had were connected to the narratives that were framed in a carceral logic. So for me, it's been really important to remember not to leave aside all of that other material that becomes about 95% of what we consume that tells us about what prisons are like. And I could scare you with more examples of how people who actually work on these issues, I'm talking about DAs and other people who think they understand what prison life is like, use those models from popular culture. So I'm switching now from the work that specifically and obviously is about abolition to telling you a couple of stories about things that I've encountered. And these come more from teaching, but they also come from prison organizing. One of the things that I started to realize as I teach about these issues is that we have a problem of the particular kind of narrative which is set in about mass incarceration in the United States in particular. And it's worth mentioning here because it's a globalized, it's a perspective that's being globalized quite quickly. And it has to do with the idea that incarceration in the United States is basically about over-incarcerating Black and sometimes also brown people. But we often forget, and my students literally never mention Indigenous prisoners when we first start speaking. And so one of the reasons for that, I try to explain early on, is epistemological. That we're not really clear that when we're doing a lot of our work on prisons, that we're abiding by the organization of prisons, which separates federal prisons and jails in Indian country. That's the category, I'm not making that up or being racist, but from the statistics on state prisoners and local jails. So what happens is that we end up talking a lot about the over-incarceration of Black people, and I'm going to challenge that term over-incarceration in a second, and we talk almost never about the tremendous problem of incarceration for Indigenous populations. So I always begin by using the work of Indigenous feminists, and in particular, I'll name someone, her name is Audra Simpson, whose work on the concept of refusal has been deeply important to me. And it's a way of grounding our conversation about abolition first in thinking about what kinds of information we don't have access to and what does not appear for us. So really what I'm adding to our conversation today is a challenge to think, you know, how many times are we relying, even as we think we're not being positivistic, or even as we think we're working against the ways in which the state mobilizes statistics against us, how many times are we also capitulating to those statistics and absorbing the epistemological norms? In many cases, I think that looking at the work of abolition, of Indigenous feminists is inspiring and has led me to doing a number of different kinds of work, including in Australia, where I work with an organization called Sisters Inside, which is an amazing organization that simultaneously provides service for people inside, people who are on remand, people who are leaving prison, and also those who have been marked by prison, including children of prisoners and others, but they also work in an abolitionist frame. So they are constantly willing to challenge the state's narratives about the people that they're working with, and this is, as you might imagine, a very high-risk operation. I often talk about this organization because it's been deeply inspiring to me. It's not to say that they haven't suffered from this position that they've held. Sometimes, for example, they're not allowed to have their management meetings because half of their management board is actually comprised of prisoners. And so they are sometimes not able to have a management meeting because they're kept from accessing the prison. as a result of the positions they've taken. Nonetheless, they always succeed in returning to operation, and they always succeed for me in challenging my idea of what's possible in the kind of organizing we do. And I think especially because, Kelsey and others, we heard earlier on about relationship to sexual violence work, and I think a lot of us have sort of moved away from whatever roles we had before, and we are uncomfortable in that service provision, but that work does need to be done. So how can we actually do that work in an environment where we are able to also be challenging of the very frames that we're given to do it? The reason I mentioned Sisters Inside in that context of Indigenous feminism is also because there are, that organization centers Indigenous experience. It probably is not news to people in here, but even though I don't like statistics, I'll use them right now, that actually, if we want to talk about over-incarceration, the Indigenous population in Australia is over-incarcerated at a rate that's higher than African Americans in the US. Okay, it's not Oppression Olympics, but I just want to say that it's important to recognize this because, again, this is a subaltern population we rarely talk about, and it's that post-colonial attention to subalternity that taught me to pay a lot of attention to that. Another thing that I've realized in doing this prison organizing is that we are having a new kind of trouble with what I'll start by characterizing as Islamophobia. I was once in a room where someone was asked, who does this kind of work, and intersectional work, about Islamophobia, and the response was to put Islamophobia into the category of the racisms we already know and understand. And I've increasingly felt that this is a really deep mistake. That in fact, in order to talk about Islamophobia, we have to also talk about secularism. And I don't have the space to do that in a complex way today, but I think this is one of the deepest challenges we have currently to abolition feminism. My work on issues of Palestine has allowed me to realize how articulate and informed Palestinians, not only in the diaspora but also in the West Bank, are about African American or US Black struggles. But most of us in the United States are not yet so sophisticated, though the Ferguson protests and other opportunities have really increased the relationship between the Black struggle in the US and the Palestinian struggle. And that is a wonderful thing, and it occurred because of the ways in which Palestinians were of so much assistance to us in our struggles. But we don't always address a further complication that struggle does raise. And I think most of us are shy about talking about Islam or talking about certain kinds of observance. And we're more comfortable with secular Muslims than we are dealing in our environments with others. And so increasingly I find that I'm wanting us to be in these kinds of spaces where I feel like some of our conversation has advanced, and really pause to think about what we need to do to try to address that. And finally, I will give you a story which didn't come from my prison abolition work, but I often use to explain some of how I think about that work. And it comes from my first time, it makes me look stupid, so that's why I laugh. It comes from my first visit to South Africa. And, I told you about my training. So the first time I went to South Africa, I was being what I thought was a good US Black subject. So here are my good things. I try not to take up all the space talking. I try not to have everyone translate for me. So, at the end of maybe my first few days of being there, I was in a cab with some people that I'd made friends with. And they were speaking to each other, and I was being good Black subject, and I didn't ask them to explain anything to me, and I just sat and let them laugh and talk. And then at the end, I said, oh, could you tell me what language you were speaking? Because I thought, well, good Black subject, I'll start to learn whatever language that they're speaking. And they burst out laughing at me, and of course, I had no idea why. They were friendly, but they were laughing. Because they said, well, in the last half an hour, we've spoken about 8 languages, so we really don't know how to help you. So, what I have taken from that moment, and the reason why I use this story, is it's the shortest route to explaining something which I think is actually rather complicated. That I, as someone trained in comparative literature, who had always had to go against the European norms that established that field, and had tried to work in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa, and had been interested in deep language learning and resistant to smooth translations and all of those things, it had never occurred to me that this kind of translingualism would be a challenge to my being able to feel that I could participate. So it's just another example that I learned from both Black British feminism, post-colonial feminism, and other kinds of theory and practice, that this inability to translate, but beyond that, a sense of being outside of the possibility of true communication, or of a certain kind of communication that I previously understood, was something that I was going to have to accept. But not only accept it, but be excited by it, be provoked by it, be spurred on by it. And it has led me to spend more and more of my time in places where I am fundamentally, in some ways, not relevant, and only am present by permission of those who are willing to share with me. So for me, some of the most dynamic environments that I'm in, where the prison question and the question of sexual violence, and so many of the questions that I have studied and worked on for most of my life are made more complicated, are in those South-South dialogues. Those dialogues that bypass the West, and that are not accessible to me in a simple way. But I corrected myself a moment ago when I said that there couldn't be true communication, because I actually believe there can be communication. But there is a necessary mode of listening that must attend that struggle for communication, and to enhance and to return to the sense of living with difference that Audre Lorde gave us. I try to stay with that sense of being outside that those dialogues give me. Thank you. So I tried to leave enough time that we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, would you like to sit down for questions or stand up?
I can sit down.
Excellent. Okay, yes. Yes, we do. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Gina, so much. And one of the things I really noticed in your language was how much your language was about learning and being taught by Cassandra about how prison classifications work, being taught by Black British Cultural Studies, what you receive when you're hearing a language that you can't translate. It's such a generous way of working to be all about what we can receive. So thank you so much for that really inspiring lesson in the language of learning. So now it's time for questions. Okay.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. I know you didn't want to elaborate on it there, but I wanted to, if you could now. I think you were alluding to the American descendants of slavery and their distinction between more recent Africans in the United States. And I wanted to get your perspective on kind of how that category has come to being, especially in the context of a conversation about reparations. And when African Americans are looking for kind of, yeah, like looking for reparations, economical
Right.
and otherwise, where are more recent Africans placed in that, and
Right.
whether they can like express like frustration with imperialism in a kind of economic reparation sense in the United States, whether that's inappropriate.
Okay, so thank you for your question, I think. We were talking about this earlier. So there's a new term for what I am, I think. I just learned it yesterday. So apparently but I think I don't know if the A must be American, which I don't try not to use. You notice I try to use US because, I do enough work in Latin America that really seems awkward to me to say American. But I think the term is ADOS, American Descendant of Slavery. Is that right? Yeah. So, thanks. This has only recently emerged, although it's not disconnected from a past, of course. So let me try not to say what I think is right or wrong about it, but to give some context for the emergence. And I'll start with reparations the way I would like to think of it. I think everyone in this room would understand what we're talking about when we talk about reparations. Yeah. So, and it's not unprecedented in the United States to have some form of reparations. And the example that's often talked about is for Japanese Americans who were, we used to say interned, but we now say imprisoned during World War II. And I make that point because it is Japanese Americans who've been insisting on not having that somehow lowered in its significance by calling it internment. And so those who were interned or incarcerated during that period did receive remuneration from the federal government, not in the amount that would really make sense, but as some kind of symbolic, I think it was $20,000 at the time, but the money is not important, it's the symbolic gesture. And the question at the time, of course, emerged, well, what about those who are descendants of slavery? And so there have been now generations of conversation about this. And I think the conversation got much more interesting when we started to redefine reparations beyond individuals who had received checks. And when we started to tie that conversation to abolition feminism. So we do know that there are racialized, gendered patterns that are deeply connected to class, that are that make the prison industrial complex a place to learn about these forms of oppression and many other things. But the problem is that a lot of the reparations conversation has to do with trying to distinguish who deserves what. But most of the activists that I know, and certainly anyone that I work with, is really much more interested in thinking about how particular communities, particular neighborhoods have been set up, for example, to have over-policing and what it might mean to think about reparations in that context, or to think about the way in which education, for some, means becoming an intellectual, and education for others means being beaten by academia. And I'm making that distinction because as a professor, I really find it awful when we talk in a negative way about being intellectuals. Because I think everyone I teach is an intellectual, and actually if they're not, it's because they've been deprived of the opportunity to become an intellectual, meaning a thinking being beyond the age of 2 or 3, where every child thinks, right? And at a certain point, education is treated as the thing which teaches you not to think anymore and to take information and give it back in the form that it was given. So, for me, reparations, and the school teachers talk about this too, could involve rethinking education. It could involve how we, think about Western medicine. It can involve all those things. I know I'm avoiding a question. I'm not avoiding it. I'm just saying, if I were going to talk about reparations, this is what I would talk about. This is what I think abolitionists would talk about. There is something else, though, that is odd. And I'm going to say something that I normally would not say. But I was with someone at one point and they said, "Oh, aren't your parents from the Caribbean?" I said, "No, actually my parents are from the US." And so they said, "Oh, how about your grandparents?" I said, "No, actually my grandparents were also from the US." I found later that the point was that they thought I was, I'm gonna use those words, articulate and intelligent, right? So there was this idea that, that I could not be who I was if I hadn't more recently come from somewhere else. Those places also, let me just be clear, experience, colonialism, slavery, segregation. I mean, I'm not, but I'm just reporting that. And this is a private space, so I wouldn't normally say that, but it is important to recognize there is something going on. So the reason why there are people who are eager to introduce this new term, I believe, is because there are some deep injuries that are occurring where there are distinctions made. I, as a light-skinned Black person raised in a middle-class family, am someone who has benefited in a different way from others. And if I don't recognize that, there would be something seriously wrong with me. I think it's also important to distinguish how different kinds of people are excluded from education, and sometimes newer immigrants, not because of where they're from necessarily, but because they're the ones who are able to come, then sometimes have educational backgrounds that put them at an advantage when they're in schools, right? So I think turning it into an identity question is not correct. If we want to talk about global capitalism, if we want to talk about colonialism, if we want to talk about all of these different things that I think are more important, as someone, I think it was Stella, I'm losing sight, said earlier, no, it was Suzanne, who said, all identities are political. So I don't think that we should treat any identity, category in a simple way. But I want to reject this new category that I'm supposed to want to claim. At the same time as I want to figure out a way for us to not have people asking for it because they believe that there's something that cannot be talked about. This is the same reason why there's a proliferation in the use of the term anti-Blackness, which I also find objectionable, not in and of itself, but as with all terms, they can do lots of different kinds of things. So as I've watched the term get used, I watch it being used, for example, against Muslims. I watch it getting used against other kinds of groups that are in the U.S. context, and of course we know globally, but I'll just talk about home, are suffering terribly. So I don't want a term that's supposed to defend me to be used against someone else that I'm in the struggle with. So I'm really concerned about the way that if I define myself as ADOS, I think that's what it is, right? ADOS, or what am I supposed to say? I don't know, hashtag, whatever, I don't know. But if I'm supposed to define myself that way, do I just get to be that and not do anything else? Like I'm just born and then I get that and then I deserve reparations. I would prefer that we think about how we want to grow the movement by growing people into an environment in which we're all trying to transform, and that we are both open and at the same time we're careful about the various kinds of things that have been raised today in the ways that there are internal struggles within movements that allow us to think about these complexities.
Thank you so much.
Is that non-answer answer enough?
It's a wonderful answer. Full, and I have a question here. And here. I have two questions, but I saw you first say it.
Thank you so much. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about how that story that you told about the person who the prison doesn't know what to do with, do you think that might help us think about abolition in a different way? Because I think that and we've heard and we know that obviously the most vulnerable people are the people who end up in prison. But I think maybe sometimes that I think part of that is a moral argument, and yes. I don't think that you can appeal to carceral logic with morals, because the carceral logic says that those people deserve to be imprisoned anyway. Right. So do you think that, like, I don't know, there's something about that person that doesn't fit into the categories of somebody who should be in prison, whatever that means? Do you think that can help us think about abolition or the case for abolition differently? Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I think I understand, but I was trying to say it almost the inverse thing. I was really trying to say that a lot of our arguments, which I agree with you, they're moral arguments. It's like we shouldn't keep mothers from their children, or people who've been using drugs, we shouldn't criminalize drug use, and it's not that I disagree with any of that. It's just that what she made us realize was that she was perceived as the most violent, the most dangerous, the most deserving of being incarcerated, that none of the ways in which we were organizing the movement before would have actually freed her. I mean, yes, we're abolitionists, so we're into freeing everyone, but in the order of people getting freed, and in the order of decarceration, right, where it's going to be gradual. It's not going to be, we just open the doors. So we're often campaigning for different kinds of people, and she reminds me that I can't just do that in a blind way. That I'll always have to be asking, who am I leaving out? And she looks like someone who's privileged, right? She's someone who had a certain kind of education, who, didn't have certain things happen to her, and yet she actually becomes like the dangerous one in the institution. So if I forget her, then I'm not really having a thorough analysis that's going to help.
Thank you.
And there was another question here. Oh, where was it? There was a question around here. Yeah. You can change your mind. It's all right.
Go ahead, Monica.
No, I wanted to ask you about carceral feminism. And if you could explain a little bit more about it and what's the debate around that
Sure.
term. Yeah.
Thank you for asking, because I was taking license because those panelists earlier, and I won't repeat what I said about y'all, but they were so sophisticated in their analysis that I felt like I didn't have to explain this, but I usually do, and so I'll just be simple because I can just pull on all the things that have already been said by those of Sisters Uncut and Curling earlier in the panel on Cambridge, and Fly, but the term carceral feminism is not the term that people who we think of as carceral feminists use about themselves. It's a term of approbation, right? It is how those of us who consider ourselves abolition feminists would characterize those that we are struggling against. And the reason for needing to name that feminism is because we are often, as we know that it's hard for people to understand they're different feminists, right? So different feminisms. But in this way, this is a very important distinction. So I think Angela said, or I'm losing, someone mentioned glass ceiling feminism. Wasn't that you? Yeah. I don't know. So there's like a version of feminism which is about, different kinds of people who've been denied access to certain jobs being able to, get higher up. So that's like the Hillary Clinton feminism, we call it at home. And so that kind, is not thinking deeply about, just to use the same term, carcerality, the ways in which we are invested, and this came out with the Sisters Uncut panel, in believing that the value of who we are is established in the length of the sentence given to the person who violates us. So, if we disagree with this, if we think that, in fact, even if we've been harmed, and maybe especially if we've been harmed, if we don't want to then also participate in further harm, then we have to simultaneously treat interpersonal and state violence. And even when, and people were talking about it so poignantly, when it's uncomfortable and painful and annoying and takes a lot of time and energy, that we have to be the ones to say that we don't define our safety. I'm just quoting the last panel, I'm quoting Sisters Uncut. We don't define our safety in the ways that bourgeois feminism, to use the older term, would define it. So I thought the comment earlier about how working class people are the ones who are less bothered by this whole idea of safe space was really important. I deal with this all the time in university. The people who come to my class and say, I feel triggered, and I'm like, see all these people here who, I'm never told that. Never is a bit, I shouldn't say that. I'm usually told that by people who have relative privilege in that classroom space, and not by others who've actually had to survive a lot of very violent environments. So safety is a bit of a complicated term, unless we're redefining it on our own terms. So abolition feminists are redefining what violence is, redefining what safety is, redefining what justice is, right? And not saying that justice would, in the carceral model, would be longer prison sentences for rape because that means that rape is a serious crime. Or, you see what I'm saying?
Could I just ask one
Please.
small follow-up question? I know we don't have much time, but you talk so eloquently about how words and terms do travel, and they often acquire different meanings. And one thing that I've learned from doing research on complaint is that carceral feminism is also a term that has travelled. And in fact, many of the people who have to make formal complaints about harassment and bullying are often identified as carceral feminists. Not because they're trying to put harassers into prison, but because that's a way of implying that the complaint is motivated by a desire for punishment and in the individuation of what are structural problems. So the use of carceral feminism to dismiss certain forms of political work is something that I've really become aware of recently. I was wondering if that relates.
I have to.
Yeah.
So this is so important and so complicated, so I'll try to do justice to that very complex question by emphasizing what I tried to say earlier in response to Monica, which is that we have to pay simultaneous attention to interpersonal and state violences or institutional violences, which does not mean only paying attention to institutional violence. So we should both be acknowledging the harms, making sure that those things which went unreported before because they were not defined as harms are recognized as harms, and take those things seriously at the same time as we then say, in response to those harms, we want transformative models. So it's we have to be the both ands. And I think this is really, after a day on Black feminism, I think this is our modality, right? We all of us are ambidextrous. We move in various environments, and we know that context is so important. So if I see someone using any of these terms, people use the term intersectionality against me all the time. I spent a lot of years, working with people before the articles on intersectionality, working with women of color, and the law conferences where people were actually generating this kind of analysis. And it was a specifically legal analysis that was designed to make it possible to talk about something that the law would not allow you to talk about. And now it's treated as if the term does the work. So we are the ones who do the work.